Hey everybody, it's Caitlin. Today is Wednesday, April 22nd, and welcome back to CoronaChat. Today's episode is the second part of a two-part installation of CoronaChat. So if you haven't yet seen yesterday's episode, go back and watch it. It'll make today's episode make a lot more sense. But this is part two of talking about how the coronavirus pandemic is changing the way that science is done and the way that science is reported and what this means for us in the news. And so today's video is going to talk a little, so yesterday's video talks about that, and today's video is going to talk about how do you make sense of the news given this new way that science is being done. So again, if you haven't watched yesterday's video, go back and watch it. And I'm just going to pick up right from where we left off yesterday. So, since we're actively dealing with a crisis now, many have noted, rightly, that the scientific and medical community needs information faster than would be available through the typical review process, right, the typical peer review process. But, as we discussed yesterday, these preprints that are being put out before peer review, while we're waiting for peer review, they haven't yet been through that process, and so they haven't been vetted with a critical eye. As other scientists read these preprints, they can often catch some of the bigger things that might raise questions about how meaningful the findings are, even if it's a little outside of their area, right? So, for example, if the study only included 11 people, its results might not accurately reflect how the treatment works for everybody. Or if the study was conducted in monkey cells grown in a lab in a petri dish, the results might not be totally applicable to human beings. These kinds of things don't mean that the study is wrong, they just mean that we might want to take the findings with a grain of salt, and that we can't extrapolate really far beyond the exact results of the study to say this is what this will mean in the world in general, right? But when the news picks up these preprints and reports about them, sometimes that kind of detail can get lost in translation. And that means that those of us reading the news can be in for some whiplash, right, with headlines screaming about the virus mutating or not mutating or being carried through the air when it's humid or only when it's dry or any of the other kinds of stuff that's in this constant, intense barrage of headlines that we're seeing. Right? And this is just on the science side, right? Never mind the news about the economy and what's going on in hospitals and schools and everything else. And keeping up with all of this can be really exhausting. So, I wanted to share a couple of tips about how personally I've been trying to decide when to, freak out about a headline and when to just take a deep breath. These won't necessarily help you figure out what is good science, but they'll help you to weed out some of the bad science, right? So again, these are just a couple kind of general tips and questions, but these are some good steps that we can all take anytime we see a news article about a new study to help us figure out, how seriously should we take these findings, right? So the first question to ask is about, who was involved in the study and where was it published, right? So a good article will mention the scientists' names, what institutions they work at, and where the study was published, right? Has it already gone through peer review and it's in an established journal, or is this a preprint? So again, preprints aren't bad, right? They just haven't been vetted, so we have to treat them with a little more skepticism than we would with a traditional peer-reviewed published article. Similarly, scientists who work at institutions whose names we don't know still do plenty of good work and good science. We just may need to do a little more research to make sure that that institution is legitimate. When we see a scientist's name, we can go and Google that person and see what kind of work they do, right? So if this is somebody who normally works on coronaviruses or normally works on respiratory illnesses or infectious disease modeling, right, then it's easier for us to trust that they know what they're doing as they're doing the study. Again, doesn't mean that the work is going to be perfect, but somebody like Ralph Barrick, who's an expert in coronaviruses, is probably going to put out a much better study than me, right? Like, I'm an expert in maternal health. And so unless I'm writing to you about specifically how coronavirus is affecting pregnant people and pregnant people's ability to, get the care they need for labor and delivery, I'm pretty far outside of my expertise. Again, doesn't mean it's going to be necessarily a bad study. It just means that I have a lot less experience on this topic than someone who is an expert in the area. Right? So the next set of questions that we might think about are, about the context of the study, right? Like, was the study conducted in humans, right? If it wasn't, it doesn't mean that the information isn't useful. It just means that we need to know more about how these findings from mice, for example, translate into human beings, right? So if the study was done in humans, then we might say, well, how many people were in the study, right? Generally, the more the better. And if it's fewer than 30, definitely take the findings with a grain of salt. If the study is about a vaccine or a treatment, right, we might ask, was there a control group that didn't get the experimental treatment, so that we're able to compare a group that got the experimental treatment and a group that didn't get the experimental treatment, right? And because if there wasn't a control group, then it's really hard to say whether that quote unquote effect was real or not, right? And again, if we've got experimental and control, we want to see at least 30 people in each one of those groups. And again, the more the better, right? And finally, just a truism, right? If something looks too good to be true, it probably is. Anytime someone's claiming that something's a miracle cure, you have to be a little cautious. Remember what Carl Sagan used to say: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if something is being touted as the new miracle cure that's going to save us all from coronavirus, we need to see some really extraordinary evidence to back up that extraordinary claim. All right, well, that's it for today. As always, if you've got questions, comments, suggestions for what we should talk about, drop them below in the comments. And now, your good news for today. We've been hearing a lot about ventilators, right? And the fact that many people who get sick with coronavirus develop difficulty breathing and may need to use a ventilator. And there's been a lot of stress about the fact that we don't have enough ventilators for everybody who might need them, and what does that mean for care for patients? Well, the good news is that the private sector is starting to step up to the plate. So businesses like the F1 Formula Racing engineers at Mercedes, folks from Airbus, from Ford, from BAE Systems, are all coming together to both repurpose their factories to build ventilators and to work to retrofit existing machines to be able to work like ventilators. With all of these efforts, we're expecting that thousands more ventilators are going to be becoming available in the weeks and months to come, and sent out to the hospitals that need them most. So again, this is another great example of how we can all kind of pull together, everybody doing their part and contributing to efforts to stop the spread of coronavirus and to treat people with coronavirus. And I think it's a great example for all of us to look to as we try to move through this together. So remember, we're all in this together. Take care of each other, stay safe, and I'll see you all back here tomorrow at CoronaChat.